Hello, in this video I'm covering the game between Aryan Tari and Magnus Carlsen from World Cup. This was the third round of World Cup and the second game they played. In the first game, Magnus won. He chose this. Magnus played Taimanov. Tari played bishop f4 here. And now d6. White took on c6, bc and queen d2. He's going for the long castle and trying to force e5, after which it's not going to be easy for black to push in the center. Black goes immediately e5, bishop g5 and knight f6, castling. Long side and now h6, bishop h4 and bishop e6. The bishop is best on e6, it controls the d5 square and if necessary d5, supporting the d5 break. Bishop e2 and now a5, king b1 and rook b8. Now white goes to a1 and queen b6, threatening to checkmate on b2, and white plays b3. Queen b4 and f3, defending the pawn. After bishop e7 he goes knight a4, after which black castles, bishop f6, queen d2 takes, and now gf. Black's position is quite solid. This bishop e7, bishop e6 and double f pawns can be seen also in Rouser Sicilian, where black is quite solid with the bishop pair, and he only needs to avoid weakening the d5 or f5 squares in that case. And Tari plays here g4, trying to stop f5 from happening, but also he weakens his pawn chain. And after a potential break in the center, white has to be very careful not to break those pawns, because in some cases g4 can become really weak, because if we exchange d6 for e4, for example d5, if it happens, something like this, now g4 might come under attack. So that's why g4 is not really good. Instead, bishop c4 was quite interesting here. Bishop c4 stops d5, and also it offers a trade of bishops, which means that black will not have a bishop pair anymore. The only setback from this is that white is going to double his pawns, but even if he does, with this and rook b4 for example, white can go back, and after doubling he just plays c3, kicks the rook away, and after this white can play g4. He completely limits this bishop on e7. In some future he also establishes f5 as a potential outpost for his knight. Instead, in the game, g4 was played, and now black plays d5. Now rook hd1. Now h5 by Magnus. He tries to break up those pawns on the king side. In case of capturing on h5, f5 would be quite unpleasant. And now you see that black has a really nice pawn chain in the center. In case of knight c3, bishop b4 would be really strong, and after this, d4. This is really unpleasant. The white's pieces look really cramped. This h5 pawn doesn't really matter because you can always pick it up by playing king g7, rook h8, and that's not a really a cause for concern for black. Instead, to keep his kingside pawns compact, he plays h3. He tries to do that. Magnus takes. Now, as you can see, he got rid of his weak h pawn. His only weakness on the board is maybe a5 pawn, but you cannot really call it a weakness because white cannot really approach it. King g7, now trying to occupy the h file, and here king b2. He takes on e4, and like I said before, now white has a really glaring weakness on e4 and g4, especially g4 because it's much easier to target. Now rook h8 by Magnus and rook d3. Rook h2, bishop f3, and now rook f2. Rook d2, and he takes and goes king g6. One pair of rooks is exchanged, but now the king gets more active. Rook h2, king g5, and now knight c3. Knight has to go into defending the position. Now rook d8 by black, knight e2, and now a4. He's trying to eliminate his weakness on a4 by just exchanging a pawn. King c3, and now rook b8. King b2, and now a3. Now he switches the plan. He wants to make less space for white's king. He pushes it towards the edge, and now back rank issues might appear. King c1 and rook d8. Now he's cutting off the white's king from getting closer to the center, and rook h5, king g6, and now knight g3. heading towards f5, bishop b4, and now it becomes really unpleasant, because bishop c3 might come next, completely tying down white's queenside. Also, white's king will be completely useless. Knight f5, and now bishop d2. And now it would be really reckless to play king d1 because of a move like bishop f4. If king e1, then rook d2. The c2 pawn is going to hang, and also b3 next. He chose to go back. Now bishop c3. And now Tari gave one check, rook h2, and after rook d7, knight f5 back. If he took on c6, it looks like this knight is going to be trapped anytime soon. Tari didn't dare to do that. Instead, he gave a check on f5, and now Magnus took on f5. It was much better to just avoid this exchange, because it leads to a opposite color bishop's ending with rooks, which is a much better version, but still it has some drawish tendencies. If king g6, rook h5, now black can go rook d2, because if he doesn't play rook h5, king gets closer and closer, and he infiltrates into the white's kingside. But if you stop king g5, you cannot stop rook d2. There always has to be some concession. Instead, he takes on f5 here, gf, and now rook d4. Magnus is happy with the draw, and he's trying to squeeze this small advantage. King c1, king f8, now he's heading towards the center, because he cannot do anything on the king side since the rook is on h-file. King b1 back, and now king d7, rook g2, rook d8, king c1 now, c5, and after bishop e2, he goes bishop b2, rook h8, and now white had a chance to save the game by a move like c3. And now, in case of bishop takes, king gets to c2, white is simply covering everything, every single pawn. King is getting out of danger, and the position is quite pleasant for white. If he doesn't capture, if he plays rook h1 with the idea of going rook a1 next, then white is going to lose the a2 pawn, but white plays bishop c4, and when he takes, b4. And if rook a1, king b3 defends nicely. Now you cannot push the a pawn because the bishop on b2 hangs. What does black do here? If he goes rook c1, rook c2 is possible. If you don't exchange rooks, white can even go with b5, which might lead to some small trouble for black even. And if you exchange, it's a dead draw, because after you liquidate on the queen side, you can do this, king d6, bishop d5. You don't even have to capture this pawn. You can just keep this a2 pawn with your king, keep the e4 pawn with your bishop, and it's a dead draw. Just get to a2 and move the bishop along this diagonal, a8, d5, and you'll be fine. So instead he plays rook g1, and now after rook h4, bishop d3, now king d6, rook d1, and now king c7. Here, if white tries c3, now black can capture, and after king c2, like in the previous case, bishop a5 is going to come. And now you don't have bishop c4 and bishop d5, because the e4 pawn is under attack. In this position, after c3, bishop c3, king c2, bishop a5, here you had bishop c4, because the e4 pawn was not under attack. And next move would be bishop d5, defending basically everything, every single pawn, and holding the position. But in this case, it's not like that. He doesn't play c3, he plays rook d1, king c7, rook e1, king b6, and after a couple of more moves, black's king gets closer to the queen side. He plays rook d1 here. Now king gets closer, and now white doesn't have time to play c3, because if he plays c3 now, bishop c3 is very strong. And in case of this, he has enough time to go for rook g2. The point was that after c3, bishop c3, white always had this tempo with king c2, but now it doesn't make sense, because you can just play rook g2, the bishop on c3 is defended, and after king b1 you can give a check, and it's game over, because you have to surrender the a2 pawn. Because if you do this, then rook d2 loses the rook on d1. Now it was too late to do that. He shuffled, and now rook f4, rook h1, rook g4. They repeat a couple of more times. And now he goes bishop d4, rook f1, bishop e3, rook d1, and bishop d2. Using the fact that white has a weak last rank, rook f1, and now king goes closer, rook f3, king d4, rook f1, Black has a very nice, very powerful idea. Now black plays c4. Using this overloaded bishop, now white cannot capture with the pawn, because rook h8 would lead to a soon checkmate, rook b8 and bishop c3. White has to capture with the bishop, which is very sad, losing the e4 pawn. Now white is trying to liberate himself. King c2, now e4, and after this bishop b4, now the e pawn is going to be a menace. Bishop c4, and now rook h1, trying to go rook a1. Bishop f1, trying to stop it, because if you go rook f1, then rook h2 and the a2 pawn is going to hang in this variation. So he goes bishop f1 to stop rook a1. But after rook g1, white is simply in Zugzwang here. If he goes to d1, what to do? King e3. And now if rook e2 check, king f3. And now the bishop on f1 is lost. There's only one little trick that black has to be careful about, and that's this one. After king c2, he should just go bishop a5, avoiding stalemate tricks. Like in this case, if black takes on f1, rook e3, and now he should avoid getting king f4. Now black is losing the pawn on e4, because if he goes to f4 to defend it, or if he takes the rook, it's stalemate. Because after king f4, rook e4, black captures, this is a draw. If he doesn't, then he loses the bishop. So bishop a5 here is much better, because now white doesn't have a stalemate, because now he has a b pawn to move. Instead he plays rook e2, and after rook f1, Tari took on e4, and he resigned here, because he knows that Magnus is going to play king c5, and black is just left with the extra piece. White is going to lose the f5 pawn, and it's game over. And that's how Magnus qualified to round 4. In round 4, his opponent was Radoslav Wojtaszek. Thank you so much for watching, and have a nice day. Goodbye.